Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this press conference to mark the launch of I Was Someone Else's Property, Amnesty International's report on slavery, human trafficking, and torture in Cambodia's scamming compounds. A warm welcome to everyone here joining us in Bangkok and also those joining us online. My name is Chanatip. I'm Amnesty International's researcher, and I'll be the moderator of today's discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to share some housekeeping details with you. As I mentioned earlier, today's discussion would be in both Thai and English, so please get a translation device if you need one. Now, and also second, if you're interested in receiving a copy of this full report, the report itself is not available in hard copy today, but it would be embargoed until 1 p.m. today. So that means it would be available on our website, amnesty.org, at 1 p.m. Once the event is done, you can go to the back and scan the QR code that we have at the registration desk. Now, let us turn to the research report that we're all here to talk about. This report is the result of an 18-month-long research project by Amnesty International. I'm joined today by Amnesty International's Regional Research Director, Montse Ferrer, who will present the main findings of this report and discuss the organization's key recommendations to the Cambodian government and other stakeholders. I'm also pleased to be joined by Jaruwat Jinmonca from Immanuel Foundation, one of the most prominent anti-trafficking organizations here in Thailand. Jaruwat and the Immanuel Foundation have been providing invaluable support to Thai victims of trafficking, including those survivors who faced human rights abuses that we are featuring in our report today. After the presentation from Montse, we will be having a conversation with Jaruwat about his expertise in the field. And after hearing from both speakers, I'll open the floor for questions here in the room and through Zoom. So before we jump into the discussion, we'd like to show you a video that summarizes the findings of this research.
Ever wonder who is behind these scam messages? The truth is, it could be a victim of human trafficking held in a compound like this one in Cambodia, where people are forced to run online scam under the threat of torture. Amnesty International new research uncover a vast network of scamming compounds and document the Cambodian government's gross failure that risks them being complicit in the abuses. But before we go any further, here is where the story begins. In the 2010s, gambling boomed in Cambodia, mostly run by criminal gangs. After online gambling was banned in 2019, the gangs saw a new opportunity to make money, creating a billion-dollar shadow economy built on slavery. They turned disused casinos and hotels into scamming compounds. It is dangerous for survivors to appear on camera, so we recreate our interview with Lisa, not her real name.
I only know that if you don't work and don't do as they tell, you get beaten. And if you're a man, they're probably going to beat you to death.
This was the moment victims trying to escape a scamming compound in 2022. Two escapees died trying to swim across the river that separates Cambodia and Vietnam, opposite the compound. Police later raided the compound and made arrests, but they did not shut it down. We spoke to a 16-year-old Thai national who was confined at the same compound later that year. In our investigation, we identified more than 50 scamming compounds, most of them implicated in forced labor, torture, and other ill treatment. At least 21 have been investigated by authorities multiple times, but never shut down. When we wrote to the government, their response ignored our findings and tried to play down the issue by saying, of the nearly 1,000 cases investigated, only 5 were identified as victims of confinement, with 2 locations being shut down. This is despite the authorities receiving more than 2,000 requests for intervention in 2025 alone. Almost all compounds have physical security features that indicate the intention to confine people. Walls topped with razor or electric wire. Cameras facing inwards. Bars on the windows well above street level. Guard towers. And designs mirroring some prison structure with no other purpose than to stop people from getting out.
tried to escape, but they found me. They took me back to the dark room. They were 4 men. The boss had a metal pole. They beat me until my leg was swollen.
Lisa was brutally punished at this compound just a few months after the same location was subject to a police investigation.
They said I would work in administration. They sent pictures of a hotel with a swimming pool. The salary was high. I don't know how to swim, but I still want to be in the pool.
Lisa, like thousands of others across the world, was lured into the industry by fraudulent job adverts posted on social media. Lisa never saw that pool. She was smuggled across borders at night, her passport confiscated. She was held for 11 months, forced to scam, and forcibly transferred between 7 different scamming compounds, before finally being dumped in a rice field by her captors. This is slavery. People in scamming compounds are being bought, sold, and controlled as if they are property, while the authorities watch on. The question is, why is the Cambodian government not doing more to stop these abuses? International law prohibits slavery everywhere, but it thrives when governments look away.
I hope this video has made you all want to learn more about our research. Now, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Montse to present the key findings of this research in detail. Montse, the floor is yours.
How do I turn? Okay, it's on. If we could have the PowerPoint on screen, and as that's happening, I wanted to first acknowledge to say that I am here today. It's an honor and privilege to be speaking on behalf of Amnesty, but I am not obviously the full extent of the team that conducted the very risky research throughout the last almost 2 years. And I want to acknowledge them. The reason why I'm speaking and not them is because of real security risks. I think a lot of you know in this room that covering this issue as a journalist or as a researcher does raise the risks for you individually. And so in that sense, I want to thank those who can't be present, can't be physically acknowledged, and and encourage all of you to continue to do this work. Great. Let me just quickly test to see this works. Yes and no. Yes. Yes, okay. Okay, so a lot of you in this room have covered this topic extensively, and I would assume that almost everyone in this room knows about the scamming compound crisis in Cambodia. So why did we publish this report, and what's new about this report? There are primarily 3 things that I'll be talking about today that distinguish this report from others, in the sense that we are building from what others have done, and in that sense we thank those who've reported before us, and we want to focus on 3 specific aspects. The first one is the scale of the human rights crisis. In order to show the scale, what we decided to do was to actually geographically map where these locations are and what kinds of locations we're talking about. Scamming compounds, yeah? And just so we're all on the same page, scamming compounds, when we talk about scamming compounds, the definition is relatively straightforward. It has 2 components. The first one, it's a location where either online gambling or online scamming is happening. Second, and most importantly for us as Amnesty, there is human rights abuse documented in this location. We're talking about slavery, human trafficking, forced labor, child labor, torture, etc. At least one human rights abuse, but in the vast majority of cases, more than one, multiple instances of human rights abuse are documented per scamming compound. So that's what we do. The first one is show the scale by identifying 53 confirmed scamming compounds across the country and 45 locations that we refer to as suspicious. I'll talk more about those later. Second, the human rights abuse. We've all heard of the human rights abuse. What we wanted to do in this report is go in depth, talk about, for example, trafficking routes in the context of human trafficking, look at debt bondage in the context of slavery, etc. So we'll be talking more about that. And third, and this is the primary focus of this report, everyone knows, or everyone has said, that the state is not doing enough. And we wanted to understand what that actually meant. So what we did is we went compound by compound to identify what state actions had happened and then identify patterns of state failure. That's what I'll be talking about today. Underlying all of these findings is Amnesty International's methodology. In this case, we interviewed 58 survivors, and when we refer to survivors, they're individuals who are victims but also have survived human rights abuse. We were able to speak to 58 of them, and all of them faced risks for speaking to us, and so we are protecting their identity in the report. The names used are not their real names. In addition to that, we had access to 365 records of victims, meaning people who were they were all confined at scamming compounds, but they either escaped or were quote unquote rescued. In addition to that, we spoke to 20 organizations, local, regional, international, many of whom are working on anti-trafficking efforts. This would not be possible without them. But also for security reasons, we are not naming them. And then we also talk to witnesses. When we mean witnesses, we're talking about individuals who either work or live close by to the scamming compounds. We were able to talk to them as well. And finally, we visited almost every single site we'll be talking about. We visited 52 of the 53 scamming compounds and 44 of the 45 suspicious locations. Okay, so the first broad aspect of our findings is what I was saying earlier about the scale of the crisis and how did we do it. We wanted to identify the buildings, the actual infrastructure. And the map shown right here, which you will see when you get the report, maps out both scamming compounds and suspicious locations. The scamming compounds are in yellow, the suspicious locations are in orange. Here is a zoom. You'll have a few of these zooms in the report. This is Sihanoukville. We would refer to this as the hotspot within the country because this is the location where we identified the most amount of scamming sites. What we wanted to do was understand what are these buildings like? And so about a third of the report is focused on that. What the team identified were patterns of what we refer to as physical and organizational security features. Individuals talked to us and told us that they were held in prisons. Some even said they're worse than prisons. Prisons take many different shapes and forms around the world, but I think we all know that prisons are meant to confine individuals, and this is what we're seeing. There are two types broadly of buildings, those who are repurposed, so they were something before a scamming compound, and then they were repurposed. Infrastructure like this, security features like barbed wire, CCTV were added on. And then we saw another group of buildings that were what we refer to as purpose-built. They appear to have been built for the purpose of unclear what operations inside, but certainly to confine individuals. This is one of the compounds in Sihanoukville, and as you can see, we've been marking the physical and organizational security features. We're talking about cages or bars on windows, CCTV. CCTV is not unusual, of course, but what's unusual is that the CCTV that we observed in many of these sites was inward facing. In other words, it wasn't about who trespassed the building, but it was to ensure that no one left. This is particularly interesting, this image, because in the middle there's a square. That's a guard tower. A guard tower that only has the sight line into the compound, which means, again, the reasonable conclusion is they're not observing people outside trying to come in, but rather ensuring that no one leaves. This is another site, this one in Phnom Penh, and what we're seeing here, which we saw in a lot of sites, are razor wire, double lining of razor wire, and it is inward facing, again, to ensure that people don't leave. This is one of the buildings that we refer to as, or compounds rather, that we refer to as likely purpose-built. It does look in some ways like a prison, and I'll talk about a couple of features of it. What's zoomed here is a parasol at the gate with a guard, what appears to be a guard position. And the circles in yellow are other guard positions that were observed through satellite imagery. This is another site that looks very similar, and similarly here we have guard positions throughout the interior perimeter wall. Again, we felt quite comfortable concluding that because these guards were inside the perimeter wall, did not have a sight line to the outside, that they were very likely controlling and monitoring the movements of those inside. So why did we care about identifying this infrastructure? For two reasons. One, because this gives us a blueprint for you and others to continue investigating, to know what to look for, so to speak. But the second one, and this is where I turn now to the second key finding around human rights abuse, imagine yourself in this location. You're observed constantly. You can't leave. The walls are higher than you could ever climb. And you have guards, in some cases hundreds of guards, observed by us and told by survivors, monitoring your every movement. That's the kind of places that the individuals we spoke to are living in, are confined in. Let me turn to the second key finding, human rights abuse. Again, the findings of this abuse in and of itself are not new, but we really wanted to bring out significant detail. This is a quote said to us by Jin, an alias, a Chinese national who was confined at one of the scamming compounds that we identified. And he said, he being the compound manager, said to me, "You will not get out of here, not in 1 or 2 years." This quote is reflective of what we refer to as the climate of fear. Climate of fear is where individuals are placed from moment one. It can be from the moment they arrive at the scamming compound, or it can be from the moment they are placed in a car in China, thinking they're going to be going to work at a factory. Until the moment they leave, escape, or are quote unquote rescued, these individuals live in constant fear. We'll talk about the violations and abuse that we've observed, but the important thing is to understand that human rights abuse, they're often overlapped. You're suffering more than one abuse, and they are compounded. Human trafficking, all but one person interviewed was trafficked. Generally, what we were told was people were lured into these jobs. The number one red flag of this advertisement, which you probably cannot read, but is high salaries. People are always looking to make a living for their families. We had survivors who were trying to make money for family members who were sick, others who were simply trying to find better job opportunities than in their village, in their city. And so this advertisement talks about work that you can do in different countries. It's an urgent vacancy, and you're being paid $1,200 to $1,500 US. Perhaps too good to be true, but people are quite interested in these kinds of jobs. That's how the majority of people were brought into work, through these kinds of ads that are posted on Telegram, Facebook, TikTok, etc. On arrival, every single individual that we spoke to had to work, and the vast majority on online scamming. There are some cases where it appeared to be for online scamming, but it was unclear. For example, there was one case where individuals, all they did at the scamming compound they were in initially, photos were taken of their faces, presumably to open bank accounts. But all of them were forced to work. None of them were paid fair wages, and the vast majority were not paid for their work. Most problematically, all the people we spoke to felt that they could not say no. They could not reject the work that they were being required to do. We have a few illustrations here from a guard with a shock baton, which was extremely common. A lot of people, those who had passports, given that many people actually didn't even take their passports, or IDs, they didn't know they were leaving the country, whichever country they came from. But for those who had, their passports were confiscated. And all of them, going back to the climate of fear and security features, felt monitored, felt they could not escape. We interviewed 9 children, Of the 58, 9 were children, and of the records that we discussed earlier, many were children as well. In this case, the illustration is of 2 Chinese girls who were 14 years old when they were taken to the scamming compound, when they were trafficked. And what they were shown was a video of someone else being tortured. And they were told, you have to work or else. In addition, their initial trafficker knew their age, but on arrival, the trafficker told them to lie about their age, and if anyone found out their true age, they would never be returned home. They lived in constant fear, what we conclude to be psychological torture. Speaking of torture, so many of the individuals that we spoke to were directly tortured and/or witnessed torture, which can very much result in psychological torture. 36 of the 58 survivors were tortured or witnessed it. This is an illustration of Lisa, a Thai victim, who you can see in the video, and this is a recreation of something that she talks about in her testimony. She tried to escape twice. She was well aware of the risks, but she tried anyway. And the second time she was caught, she was brought into what many refer to as the dark room. The dark room is a room where a lot of the torture takes place in these locations. She was held down by 3 men while a 4th one hit the soles of her feet for hours. She was incapacitated and spent 3 weeks on a bed. Thank you. 3 weeks without being able to walk. These are other illustrations of the kind of torture that many of the survivors told us about. Some were hit with dumbbells, some were hit with the electric shock baton, seemingly the preferred tool of torture of security guards, those who were involved, which were rarely the security guards. It was usually compound managers and bosses who were conducting this torture. Confinement. Confinement under international human rights law is referred to as deprivation of liberty. Every single individual that we spoke to and every single victim of whose record we had access to was confined. They were not allowed to leave. That's the image of a gate of one of the compounds with guards manning that position on a constant basis. And finally, slavery. Slavery is a serious crime and human rights violation. We are confident that many of the individuals that we spoke to were victims of slavery for the reasons that we just talked about: forced labor, torture, confinement. But in addition, there were many individuals who were actually sold. They knew they were sold, they overheard they were sold, and so they had zero control over their future, their body. One thing that we also documented extensively was debt bondage. There were individuals who arrived at a location and were told at the very beginning of their time, and were told, oh, well, we just spent $5,000 transporting you here from, say, China or Thailand or Vietnam. Now you owe us $5,000, and you're not going to leave until you pay us back. Of course, these were arbitrary amounts, and except for one person, no one ever hit their debt bondage, and even that person was not allowed to leave after that. And in many cases, when people were moved from compound to compound, the debt just increased. So maybe you owed $4,000, you're sold to another compound, you now owe $10,000. A lot of the individuals were sold across scamming compounds, from compound to compound. So, turning to the last finding and the most problematic one, it's the failures of the Cambodian state that we believe point to complicity. What we really wanted to do, as I said earlier, was map out, what does that mean, failure to investigate? So what we did is we prepared an annex, which is longer than the report. You'll see it very soon when you have it. And the annex, I'll just explain what the annex is, because the annex is in some ways what distinguishes this report. The annex is an amalgamation of evidence collected for every single scamming compound. So for every single scamming compound, you'll have a profile like this. And what we wanted to do was look at public records of when was there state intervention, if any. This is the first case. Sorry, just getting to the page. This is the first case. It's in Bavette, and it's a great example. We have a chronology that works through, starting in 7 October 2021 until mid-2024. Many of them end in early 2025. And throughout that time, we have extensive reporting from Voice of Democracy, unfortunately now closed in large part because of precisely this work in Cambodia. But it shows extensive media report and state intervention. When we refer to state intervention in these compounds, what we mean is the state going in primarily to rescue individuals. We always use the quotations rescue because rescues are nothing like what you would expect a rescue to be, and we'll have someone who'll be able to talk later about what that means in practice. But essentially you have police many times showing up at the gate of a compound. The reason they're there is because an individual who's confined inside a compound has called, in the vast majority of cases, multiple times to friends, media, police, consular services. Finally, there's someone who forces a police officer to go. That police officer shows up, talks to the compound manager and says, "Can you hand me individual X?" And the compound manager goes in, sometimes with a police officer, sometimes not, brings the individual to the police officer, hands this individual over, and the police officer leaves. That's what we talk about when we say a rescue. In other words, police are not entering, conducting a raid, observing what they're observing, identifying potentially hundreds or thousands of victims and taking collective action. No, that is not a rescue. A rescue is what I just mentioned. Can we even name it a rescue? So that's what the chronology does for each compound. It identifies those that we were able to access based on public records. We are sure that there's more out there. So this is what we had access to. That's where you can see for the first one, the chronology. In addition to that, we identify for each scamming compound the physical and organizational security features. This is a really good example. This one had perimeter fencing with barbed razor wire, use of electric fencing, which is quite rare and problematic, internal facing security cameras, floodlights along perimeters, security guards with firearms, security guards and guard posts at internal checkpoints, and cages or bars on windows. We do that for every single one. And then we have a section at the end that identifies the specific human rights abuse that we were able to document per location and state responsibility. And that's why I wanted to walk you through the annex, because that's where we include location by location, what behavior, what actions the state has taken, and the massive failure. The conclusion of the 53 scamming compound profiles is the following. Over a third, or 20 compounds, were the subject of one or more interventions like the one I just described. In some cases, they were full raids. And all of them, we were able to document human rights abuse after state intervention. In other words, police know exactly what's going on. They, in fact, took action. And we're able to speak to someone who, subsequent to that, was in the compound and suffered human rights abuse. 20 compounds. The next category is over a third, or 18 compounds, where we know there's human rights abuse. Well, we know there's human rights abuse for all of them, but we know there was human rights abuse, and we just simply, and we know that they continued operating. We simply don't know if there was any kind of action, but based on our records, there wasn't any action. And in those cases, records are public, and or individuals have been subject to human rights abuse. So there's no reason why the Cambodian state should not know what's going on in those locations. We also share them with the government. The next category is less than a third, or 13 compounds. Again, they were subject to some state intervention as far as we know. We were just simply unable to determine whether human rights abuse continued. Not because it didn't, but just because the individuals that we spoke to were there before. And finally, extremely disappointingly, and this is where you start to ask the tough questions, 2 compounds out of 53, 2 compounds are shut. Most problematic is that this is a pattern. And what we see directly from survivor testimony is instances, systemic instances of corruption and collusion. There are cases where individuals talk about payment of bribes, but in the majority of cases, it isn't that. It is knowing that the police are involved, either because an individual survivor calls the police to try to get a rescue, and next thing, they're tortured the next day, and certainly not rescued, or because it is visible to them that compound managers and police are talking, seemingly discussing the release of an individual or 2. These are not exceptional. As you will see in the report, because we include a lot of the survivor testimony, this is systemic. We are convinced that the police are aware of what's happening. So that's why we are comfortable in talking about, or rather asking, why is this happening? Why is the Cambodian state allowing it to happen? Which is why we conclude that it's pointing towards complicity, given the failure of protecting these individuals from human rights abuse. I won't go through this, but effectively it's a summary of what I've just talked. We're talking about failure to effectively investigate, failure to promptly and effectively identify, assist, and protect victims. I haven't talked about it now, but we also have a section in the report that looks at what happens to a survivor when they're rescued. Well, some of them are more afraid what could happen to them if they are rescued by the police than of staying. That should tell you enough. In addition, under the Convention Against Torture, the Cambodian state has consented or acquiesced to the torture. And finally, it has failed to regulate security companies. So I've mentioned this in passing, but security guards are a key element of the physical and organizational security features of these compounds. They are there in multitude. We've observed them directly, and individuals have told us about. These are private companies that should be managed by the Ministry of Interior. And many of them are using tools of torture, which Amnesty International, and specifically the electric shock baton, has concluded should be illegal. One of our researchers actually tried to obtain an electric shock baton in the regular commercial market and was able to. That shows you how easily accessible these tools are. So, the recommendations are in the report. I'll let you read them when you get the report. I think simply I want to say that we have shared all of these findings with the government. And we shared the locations, the coordinates, hoping possibly that they would respond to them. They did respond generally to our letter, and that's Annex 3. It's a 2.5-page letter. It looks very similar to the form of reporting that the NCCT, the National Committee to Combat Human Trafficking, puts out. It's figures. Actually, the only human rights abuse identified, or rather acknowledged in that letter, is confinement. Every other human rights abuse is not responded to or acknowledged. And extremely troubling is the fact that they don't acknowledge our Annex 1 or Annex 2. Being Annex 1 is the scamming compounds, Annex 2 are a list of suspicious locations. Maybe a quick note on the suspicious locations. Suspicious locations are locations that physically look like scamming compounds. They have very similar physical and security features. And although we did not include this in the report, we also had additional indicia, links between the suspicious locations and the kind of scamming compound operations we've seen, which is why they're in that list. But they are leads. We're not confirming them as scamming compounds, but certainly encouraging those of you here, and the government, of course, to further look into the suspicious locations. So the response from the state was extremely underwhelming, and it just confirmed our findings that we've been presenting today. The last thing to say, and I'm done, is, and this is obvious, but we must say it as many times as we can, we wouldn't be here without a number of individuals and organizations who have supported this work, either directly have supported Amnesty's work and or more broadly have worked on this for years. There are journalists who've been arrested, there are journalists and media outlets who've lost their licenses for covering this, and most face risks. In addition, of course, the survivors. 58 may sound like a small number. It's a huge number. It is very hard for people to feel comfortable talking about their experiences. They continue to live in fear after they leave these compounds. Threats are made even at the time of leaving. And so we want to thank them, and of course, organizations like Mr. Jaruwat that are perhaps the only ones who are doing the right job of identifying victims and helping them out of these extremely terrifying locations. Thank you very much for coming here, and I look forward to questions later.
Thank you very much, Montse, for sharing this very important finding with us. Now, I'd like to turn to having a conversation with Kun Jaruwat, and I'll be speaking in Thai. สวัสดีคุณจารุวัฒน์อีกครั้งนะครับแล้วก็ก่อนอื่นเลยเนี่ยอาจจะอยากขอเริ่มจากการให้คุณจารุวัฒน์เล่าให้ฟังได้ไหมครับว่า Immanuel Foundation ทำงานประมาณไหนบ้างแล้วมีกระบวนการประมาณไหนในการช่วยเหลือเหยื่อของการถูกทราฟิกครับ
ครับมูลนิธิ Immanuel ครับเราช่วยเหลือเหยื่อจากการค้ามนุษย์เราต่อต้านการค้ามนุษย์ครับเราช่วยเหยื่อให้พ้นจากสถานการณ์อันตรายแล้วกันครับออกมาจากผู้ค้ามนุษย์หลังจากนั้นเราก็ช่วยในเรื่องของกระบวนการยุติธรรมนะครับในทางกฎหมายเองนะครับหลายคนผู้เสียหายในลักษณะสแกมเนี่ยครับถูกตำรวจดำเนินคดีเพราะความไม่เข้าใจนะครับมุมมองการค้ามนุษย์กับมุมมองอาชญากรเขาไม่ได้มองในส่วนของกฎหมายค้ามนุษย์ก่อนก็เลยทำให้ผู้เสียหายเนี่ยถูกดำเนินคดีเราก็จะประกันตัวผู้เสียหายให้มีอิสรภาพอีกครั้งต่อสู้นำหลักฐานสู้ในชั้นศาลนะครับแล้วก็รวมถึงเราก็ส่งเสริมอาชีพนะครับดูแลเรื่องร่างกายและจิตใจนะครับในการฟื้นฟูเยียวยาครับ
ครับแล้วถ้าสมมุติว่าเรามองเจาะลึกลงไปในส่วนของเหยื่อการค้ามนุษย์ที่ได้รับการช่วยเหลือมาจากกัมพูชาเนี่ยอยากให้คุณจารุวัฒน์เล่าให้ฟังหน่อยได้ไหมครับว่าเวลาเราไปช่วยเหลือเขาเนี่ยมีกระบวนการประมาณไหนในการอย่างเช่นไปดูยังไงว่าคนไหนตกเป็นเหยื่อแล้วก็เราไปเจอเขาได้ยังไงเราช่วยเขายังไงบ้างอะไรอย่างเงี้ยครับ
ครับคือผู้เสียหายต้องเรียนพูดงี้ครับไม่มีใครสมัครใจให้ตัวเองไปถูกค้ามนุษย์นะครับแล้วผู้เสียหายที่เราช่วยมาเนี่ยเราจะช่วยหาหลักฐานเราสัมภาษณ์เขาเพื่อจะหาแนวทางนะครับเราเช็คประวัติเขาก่อนเขาเคยเข้าออกมาหรือยังนะครับรวมถึงเรารู้หลักองค์ประกอบเรื่องของการค้ามนุษย์นะครับในสิ่งที่กฎหมายไทยบัญญัติไว้นี่เราพูดถึงเหยื่อที่เป็นคนไทยก่อนนะครับ
ใช่ครับแล้วการที่เราเข้าไปช่วยเหลือเหยื่อกลุ่มนี้ครับมีอุปสรรคอะไรที่เราพบเจอบ้างครับในการทำงาน
ก็ผู้เสียหายส่วนใหญ่ที่เราช่วยจริงๆช่วยมาจากคอมเพลเนี่ยมันจะยากขึ้นแล้วเมื่อก่อนเราเคยช่วยนะครับคนที่กระโดดหนีออกมาการนั้นแนะรับผู้เสียหายหรือคราวก่อนเนี่ยช่วงแรกๆเราเคยประสานเจ้าหน้าที่ของกัมพูชาเองในการขอประสานความช่วยเหลือออกมามีประสบความสำเร็จบ้างไม่สำเร็จบ้างแต่หลังมาเนี่ยเราเลือกที่จะไม่ประสานเจ้าหน้าที่ฝั่งกัมพูชาแล้วเพราะว่าผู้เสียหายของเราครับถูกเล่าให้ฟังหนึ่งเคสนะครับคือผู้เสียหายเนี่ยร้องขอความช่วยเหลือผ่านทางสื่อมาในสื่อไทยแล้วสื่อเนี่ยดังมากคือไอ้ผู้ค้ามนุษย์เองเขาก็เห็นนะครับพอเขาเห็นในสื่อเนี่ยเขาถูกทำร้ายร่างกายนะครับโดยการช็อตไฟฟ้าการขังห้องมืดนะครับแล้วตัวเราประสานเจ้าหน้าที่กัมพูชาเนี่ยเรื่องของสื่อน้องคนนี้ครับว่าขอให้ช่วยเขาออกมานะครับเจ้าหน้าที่ตำรวจโทรหาคนจีนนะครับเจ้าของตึกบอกว่าปล่อยตัวน้องตามรายชื่อนี้ออกมาหน่อยคนจีนเขารับปากตำรวจนะครับแล้วก็ถ่ายวิดีโอเอาผู้เสียหายออกไปนอกตึกแล้วก็จนถึงเขาถึงรถนะครับออกจากตึกแล้วก็ส่งให้ตำรวจแล้วบอกว่าเนี่ยเราปล่อยออกแล้วแต่ผู้เสียหายไม่ได้หลังจากที่เขาส่งรูปแล้วรายงานตำรวจแล้วเนี่ย ผู้เสียหายเขาไม่ได้ปล่อยกลับเขาพากลับเข้าที่เดิมขังห้องมืดทำร้ายร่างกายเสียงร้องโหยหวนตรงนั้นน่ะผู้เสียหายที่ได้รับการช่วยเหลือกลับมาภายหลังนะครับเขาเล่าให้ฟังคือเราเห็นแล้วว่ากระบวนการแบบนี้มันไม่ใช่การช่วยเหลือแล้วมันจะกลายเป็นอันตรายให้เขามากขึ้นนะฮะเราก็เลยตัดสินใจที่จะไม่ขอความช่วยเหลือจากทางตำรวจกัมพูชานะครับในทางการกัมพูชาซึ่งแต่เราช่วยเหลือตอนเนี้ยกระบวนการตอนนี้เราคือใครที่หนีออกมาได้หรือใครที่เขาปล่อยทิ้งตามพื้นที่ต่างๆในทุ่งนาในสถานที่ชาวบ้านนี่ครับใครที่ปล่อยให้นอนอยู่ข้างถนนใครที่เดินกลับมาชนด่านเราช่วยเหลือเอามาคัดแยกสอบถามนะครับเพื่อที่จะให้เขาเข้าสู่กระบวนการยุติธรรมได้ครับ
ครับจริงๆคุณจารุวัฒน์หยิบยกประเด็นที่น่าสนใจมากก็คือการที่เจ้าหน้าที่กัมพูชาเนี่ยล้มเหลวเนาะในการที่จะคุ้มครองแล้วก็แม้ว่าจะได้รับข้อมูลเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของการค้ามนุษย์ไปแล้วเนี่ยก็ยังไม่ได้ให้ความช่วยเหลืออย่างเพียงพอจริงๆสอดคล้องกับข้อค้นพบของรายงานฉบับนี้เลยนะครับก็เป็นประเด็นที่น่าสนใจทีนี้ผมสงสัยอีกอย่างนึงครับว่าในการที่เราไปช่วยเหลือเหยื่อการค้ามนุษย์เนี่ยคุณจารุวัฒน์ได้เจอสถานเหมือนได้เก็บข้อมูลเกี่ยวกับสถานที่กักกันหรือว่าศูนย์สแกมมิ่งเนี่ยครับที่ Amnesty ได้เก็บข้อมูลอันเดียวกันแบบมีเจอบ้างไหมครับที่สอดคล้องกันกับรายงานของเรา
ครับก็สอดคล้องกันหลายจุดเลยนะครับตามรายงานนี้ผมอ่านและดูแล้วก็ใช่ครับมันมีจุดที่ผู้เสียหายที่เราช่วยออกมาเนี่ยมาจากจุดที่เป็นส่วนของรายงาน Amnesty ใช่ครับเยอะเลยแล้วขอเสริมเมื่อกี้อีกนิดหนึ่งนะครับคือในส่วนของกัมพูชาเนี่ยเขาปฏิเสธตลอดว่าเนี่ยไม่ใช่การค้ามนุษย์เขาบอกว่าไม่มีการค้ามนุษย์ในประเทศเขาบอกว่านี่มันเป็นเรื่องของออนไลน์หรือการช่อโกงทั่วไปครับซึ่งไม่ถูกต้องเลยเขาปฏิเสธแล้วก็ยังปล่อยปละละเลยให้มีการค้ามนุษย์
โอเคแล้วทีนี้พอมีการปล่อยปละละเลยขนาดนี้ครับจริงๆเมื่อกี้ทางคุณมอนเซ่เขาได้นำเสนอไปนิดนึงแล้วแต่ว่าผมอยากจะทราบเพิ่มเติมในเรื่องของการที่บางทีเนี่ยเจ้าหน้าที่ได้รับข้อมูลได้รับแจ้งไปแล้วมีการเข้าไปช่วยเหลือบางส่วนแล้วแต่ว่ากลับกลายเป็นว่าบางคนเนี่ยยังถูกล่อลวงกลับเข้าไปในที่เดิมอีกอันนี้พอจะช่วยเล่าให้ฟังได้ไหมครับว่าเจอเคสประมาณนี้บ้างหรือเปล่า
ถ้าถูกกลับล่อลวงไปเนี่ยทางผมเนี่ยจะมองให้เป็นกลางครับก็คือเชื่อในเจ้าหน้าที่เหมือนกันเขาสมัครใจไปรอบ2อันนั้นเราไม่เรียกว่าเหยื่อเราตัดตรงนั้นทิ้งคือเราต้องการแค่ผู้เสียหายตัวจริงนะครับไอคนที่เข้าไปซ้ำสองเนี่ยไม่ต้องพูดถึงก็ได้จับไปเลยครับอันนี้คืออาชญากรมันง่ายเราแยกง่ายเลยแต่รอบแรกมาให้เชื่อเขาไว้ก่อนทำฐานข้อมูลให้ดีนะครับจัดการปัญหาได้นะครับรอบ2นี่ไม่ต้องพูดแล้วครับเขาก็สมัครใจอันนั้นจริงๆครับ
น่าสนใจแต่อันนี้ก็คือหมายความว่าแปลว่าแม้ว่าจะบางทีเนี่ยจะมีการเข้าไปช่วยเหลือคนแล้วเนี่ยแต่ว่าศูนย์สแกมมิ่งเนี่ยก็ไม่ได้ถูกปิดตัวไป
ใช่ครับ
ยังสามารถrecruit หรือว่ารับคนเข้าไปทำงานต่อเพิ่มได้
ถูกต้องครับเขาไม่เคยทำลายเลยครับถ้าย้อนประเด็นความหมายคือมันมี2ข้อพิพาทครับเขาจะถามว่าแล้วเหยื่อเนี่ยจะคัดแยกกันยังไงเขาบอกว่าบางคนเขาก็อ้างเจ้าหน้าที่บางคนเขาอ้างว่าเขาต้องทำงานเพราะเคยช่วยมาแล้วเขาบอกว่าเขาต้องกลับไปทำเพราะต้องเลี้ยงครอบครัวอันนี้ผมว่าไม่ใช่ข้อเท็จจริงอันนั้นคืออาชญากรคุณจับไปสิผมหมายถึงเหยื่อที่ถูกหลอกไปครับเขาไปรอบเดียวเขาไม่เคยกลับไปอีกเลยเขาไม่อยากไปมันเป็นฝันร้ายของเขาใครจะไปถูกไหมครับคือต้องใช้ข้อเท็จจริงคุยครับ
ทีนี้ผมอยากลองชวนคุยถ้าเกิดว่าหันกลับมามองทางประเทศไทยนิดนึงเพราะว่าอันนี้เราคุยเกี่ยวกับสถานการณ์ในประเทศกัมพูชาเนาะแต่เข้าใจว่าทางคุณจารุวัฒน์เนี่ยช่วยเหลือเหยื่อที่เป็นคนไทยจำนวนมากนะฮะอยากถามจากความคิดเห็นว่าคิดว่าทางฝั่งรัฐบาลไทยเนี่ยมีอะไรที่สามารถจะดำเนินการได้บ้างไหมครับ
จริงๆรัฐบาลไทยต้องดำเนินการโดยเร่งด่วนตั้งนานแล้วนะครับซึ่งตรงนี้เราเห็นอยู่แล้วว่ามันเป็นเรื่องของการละเมิดสิทธิมนุษยชนการทำบ่อนทำลายประเทศด้วยนะครับการเอาคนไปขังไปฆ่าไปข่มขืนไปบังคับให้เขาเป็นอาชญากรแล้วไม่แยแสกลับมาดำเนินคดีกับกลุ่มคนพวกนี้ครับไม่ถูกต้องเราต้องมองให้ออกว่านี่คือการค้ามนุษย์เขาทำร้ายประชาชนคนไทยอยู่เขาเอารัดเอาเปรียบคนไทยอยู่เขาถูกค้ามนุษย์อยู่แต่คุณไปไม่เคยจับกระบวนการไม่เคยจับเจ้าของตึกไม่เคยเอาผิดกับกัมพูชาไม่คุยกับรัฐบาลกัมพูชาว่าเนี่ยมันสิ่งที่ไม่ถูกต้องแล้วคุณปล่อยให้ประเทศคุณมีแบบนี้ได้ไงคุณไม่เคยพูดถึง คุณจับแค่เหยื่อเนี่ยแหละครับเข้าคุกให้เขารับผิดชอบกับสิ่งที่มันเป็นเรื่องของสิ่งที่ไม่ถูกต้องมาตั้งนานแล้วครับมันควรจะรู้ได้แล้วเราควรจะรู้ได้แล้วเพราะว่าพยานหลักฐานเรามีแล้วผู้เสียหายจำนวนมากเท่าไหร่แล้วครับหลายพันแล้วครับหลายคนที่ติดคุกแล้วมูลที่เราประกันตัวมาเราสู้ในชั้นศาลเนี่ยสู้ให้อยู่45โทษครับ42คนเขาเป็นเหยื่อจริงๆแต่ทำไมมันดำเนินคดีเขาไม่เข้าใจได้ยังไงมันต้องเร่งแก้ไขไม่ใช่ปล่อยให้เป็นอย่างนี้มันนานแล้วครับผมพูดจริงมันนานแล้วมันนานเกินไปครับ
อาจจะชวนคุยเพิ่มเติมนิดนึงนะครับว่าเพราะเข้าใจว่าจริงๆในไทยเนี่ยก็มีกลไกหรือว่าหน่วยงานที่ดูแลเกี่ยวกับเรื่องการค้ามนุษย์หลายหน่วยงานทับซ้อนกันเนาะทีนี้เนี่ยอยากทราบว่าจากประสบการณ์ของคุณจารุวัฒน์เนี่ยได้ลองทำงานกับกลไกพวกนี้บ้างไหมครับเรามีประสบการณ์ประมาณไหน
มีครับเราทำงานกับเจ้าหน้าที่ไทยเนี่ยหลายคนเข้าใจมันมีหลายส่วนที่เข้าใจและหลายส่วนที่ไม่เข้าใจมีข้อโต้แย้งกันเรื่องของเขาสมัครใจไปคือเขาโยนความผิดให้กับผู้เสียหายนะครับว่าอันนี้สมัครใจรู้ทั้งรู้ข่าวออกแล้วทำไมยังไปพวกนี้แหละอาชญากรสมัครใจไปทั้งนั้นเนี่ยครับมันก็เลยไม่จบไงครับเพราะว่าเขาไม่เข้าใจเขาไม่ได้เห็นภาพทั้งหมดครับเขามองแค่ว่าเขารังเกียจใช่ผมก็เกลียดเขาเรียกว่าผมเกลียดพวกสแกมมากคือเกลียดพวกนี้มากแต่เกลียดให้ทุกคนทำร้ายให้ทุกคนไม่ใช่เหยื่อนะครับเขาจะใช้มุมมองที่ไม่ใช่เรื่องของการค้ามนุษย์ไม่ได้มันเป็นเรื่องของการค้ามนุษย์มันต้องเอามาก่อนถ้าเราไม่มองในมุมมองค้ามนุษย์ไอ้ปัญหานี้จะขจัดไม่ได้เลยเพราะเขาจะทำอะไรรู้ไหมครับไม่จัดการผู้ค้ามนุษย์จับอาชญากรที่ถูกบังคับภาคบังคับเนี่ยเอาเข้าคุกเรื่อยๆแล้ววงจรไม่ถูกตัดใช่ไหมครับต้นตอไม่ถูกตัดคอมพาวกระบวนการพาข้ามไม่ถูกจับธุระจัดหาคือคนที่หลอกในโซเชียลมีเดียคนที่ชักชวนคนเข้าไปไม่ถูกทำลายนะครับแต่กลายเป็นเหยื่อนี่แหละที่เข้าไปอยู่ขังแล้วก็ถูกบังคับให้ตีหรือบังคับให้ใช้บัญชีการใช้สแกนหน้าที่เกิดขึ้นในระยะหลังๆนี้พวกนี้ครับติดคุกแทนอาชญากรตัวจริง
ครับก็ขอบคุณคุณจารุวัฒน์มากครับจริงๆที่พูดคุยกันมาเนี่ยมีหลายๆอย่างที่สอดคล้องกับงานวิจัยของ Amnesty เนาะไม่ว่าจะเป็นเกี่ยวกับเรื่องของการปล่อยปละละเลยของเจ้าหน้าที่ฝั่งกัมพูชาด้วยนะครับแล้วก็เกี่ยวกับการละเมิดสิทธิมนุษยชนที่เกิดขึ้นภายในศูนย์สแกมเมอร์แล้วคุณจารุวัฒน์เนี่ยก็ยังช่วยให้เราเห็นภาพเพิ่มเติมด้วยว่าหลังจากที่เกิดการค้ามนุษย์และช่วยเหลือกลุ่มเหยื่อออกมาเนี่ยก็ยังไม่ได้มีการคุ้มครองปกป้องเขาอย่างเป็นธรรมแล้วก็อย่างสอดคล้องกับหลักสิทธิมนุษยชนนะครับก็จริงๆอาจจะถามคุณจารุวัฒน์แค่ว่าอยากมีอะไรอยากฝากทิ้งท้ายไหมครับก่อนที่เราจะไปสู่ช่วงของการถามตอบกัน
ครับจริงๆทิ้งท้ายเนี่ยคือปัญหาการค้ามนุษย์ครับมันต้องจัดการให้เด็ดขาดต้องเปิดใจครับต้องเปิดใจต้องเข้าใจใช้มุมมองในการแก้ไขปัญหามันเรารู้อยู่แล้วว่ามันเป็นเรื่องของการค้ามนุษย์มันมีเรื่องของการคอร์รัปชันอยู่มันมีความไม่ถูกต้องอยู่ต้องเปิดครับเปิดใจจะได้รู้ว่าเหยื่อเนี่ยมันน่าสงสารกว่าเหยื่อทั่วไปด้วยซ้ำเพราะว่าเขาถูกสังคมตีตาแล้วว่าเนี่ยเป็นอาชญากรพวกนี้นั่นแหละที่ผิดเนี่ยเขากลายเป็นเหยื่อเขาถูกหลอกเข้าไปถูกขังขนาดนั้นไปถูกทำร้ายขนาดนั้นเขาเกือบตายเขามีภาวะทางจิตบาดแผลทางกายใช่ไหมครับหลายคนที่เสียชีวิตผมพูดจริงว่าหลายคนที่เสียชีวิตจริงๆนะครับการเสียชีวิตของเขาไม่ได้สะท้อนถึงอะไรเลยรัฐบาลรับรู้เจ้าหน้าที่รับรู้แล้วยังไงทำไมไม่แก้ไขใช่ไหมครับปัญหาเนี่ยผมพูดจริงมันต้องเด็ดขาดนะฮะเพราะว่ามันกระจายทั่วโลกมันไม่ใช่แค่คนไทยแล้วนะครับมันมีหลายสัญชาตินะครับผมแค่พูดถึงคนไทยเฉยเราเห็นอยู่แล้วคนเป็นพันแค่คนไทยหลักหลายพันนะฮะแล้วต่างชาติอีกเหรอครับที่ยังติดค้างอยู่ถ้าไม่รีบแก้ไม่ได้จะไปเยินยอจะไปเทิดทูนอะไรกับอาชญากรหรือรัฐบาลที่ปล่อยให้มีการค้ามนุษย์มีมาเฟียอย่างเงี้ยทั่วประเทศเราต้องรีบจัดการรัฐบาลไทยเราต้องรีบทำเพราะอะไรผู้เสียหายเป็นคนไทยครับความเดือดร้อนนอกเหนือจากผู้เสียหายจากการค้ามนุษย์แล้วผู้เสียหายที่สูญเสียเงินอีกล่ะครับตอนนี้จับไม่ถูกจับเหยื่อจับเนี้ยกระบวนการไม่เคยทำโทษแต่เหยื่อครับ
ขอบคุณมากครับจริงๆเป็นประเด็นที่สำคัญมากเกี่ยวกับการมุ่งเน้นโทษเหยื่อแล้วก็อีกอย่างที่ผมอย หยิบขึ้นมาเน้นย้ำอีกทีหนึ่งที่คุณจารวัตรพูดก็คือจริงๆมันไม่ใช่ประเด็นปัญหาแค่ของกัมพูชาหรือไทยแต่ว่าเป็นประเด็นทั่วโลกเนาะ
ใช่ครับ
เพราะว่ามีเหยื่อจากทั่วโลกเลยที่ต้องเผชิญกับปัญหานี้นะครับก็ในช่วงนี้เดี๋ยวขออนุญาตเปลี่ยนกลับเป็นภาษาอังกฤษนะครับ Okay, I'm gonna turn back to speaking English and I think it's time for question and answer. So if anyone would like to ask us questions, either those of us who are here physically or those watching us online, please feel free to post your questions. We have a mic at the back, so you could just simply walk down there. I see we have someone.
Hi, my name is Nathapop Sangke. I am a freelance journalist focused on scamming, issue in Thai and Myanmar and Cambodia. I have a question for you. As I listened to your presentation and you focus on the situation when the victim in the scam center, right? But I would like to know about, have you interviewed the survivor after they got rescued and go back to their hometown, to their country? What happened with them? Because in Thailand we have seen a lot that the victim that when they came back to Thailand, like they got arrested by the Thai police. I just would like to know about the situation in other country that you interviewed the victim.
Do we want to take a series of questions or one by one, as you wish?
Let's do a couple.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe we'll take one more question and then we can answer in one round.
Hi there, Sarah Nuri from The Telegraph. I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about why you think the Cambodian government isn't acting on your report and the abuses in general. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sure. So to the first question, thank you for your question. Oh, there he is. Thank you for your question. So the focus of the report was not on what happens to individuals after they leave the country. So what I'm going to say is, wouldn't say that it's anecdotal, but it's based on conversations we had. It isn't necessarily reflected in the report. Essentially, individuals were, and maybe something that I didn't mention but could be useful, of the 58 individuals that we spoke to, 24 were Thai, 20 were Chinese, and then the rest were from a range of countries, including Ethiopia. So our data is very similar geographically in terms of its representation as the information, or rather nationality, of those of the victims, the records that we had access to. But on return to their countries, what we understand is that many of them were treated as criminals, which is why, and actually it aligns with very much with what Mr. Jaruwat has said today, which is why one of our recommendations for countries whose nationals are victims of the scamming compounds is to work on proper identification of victims on arrival, providing support. There's a whole framework of this under human trafficking international law, and actually most countries, interestingly, have that in their national legislation, but they don't seem to be applying it. And in fact, part of the research that what we wanted to do here, and more on the campaign side, is to increase awareness internationally of the distinction between, as Mr. Jaruwat said, a scammer and a victim. They're different, but actually on return, many are treated the same. They're either treated the same or they're treated not as victims and as individuals who come back and have no support whatsoever. So I hope that answers the question. Again, we don't talk too much about return and what happens then. We talk more about what happens to individuals who manage to escape or leave, or who are rescued by police in Cambodia. And so conditions around prison conditions, immigration system, the kind of support that the Cambodian government claims to provide, all of that is discussed. And obviously the conclusion is that it falls way short of the own commitments of the government and international human rights law. To answer your second $1 million question, why is this happening in Cambodia? It's clear that it's happening because the Cambodian government is allowing it to happen. I think we're comfortable concluding that. We do believe, unlike Myanmar, for example, another of the hotspots of scamming compounds where territory is in dispute across different armed factions, that's not the case in Cambodia. Cambodia has absolute sovereignty and control over its territory. And so if it's allowing it to happen, the fair conclusion, which we will let all of you reach your own conclusions, but is that they are benefiting in some way. So that's the answer. I will say that we're continuing our research to properly provide an answer to that of how are they benefiting. So, to come. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Poppy McPherson from Reuters. What does effective pressure on Cambodia look like? Like, are we talking about sanctions, and who should be doing it? What are you looking to see from ASEAN or other countries?
Maybe I just respond. Or do you want another question?
Does anyone else want to ask another question? Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Paula Banerjee from the Asian Institute of Technology. My question relates to funding. Who owns the scamming grounds, you know? And now we see that there's a huge crisis of funding. Particularly after the stoppage of funding with the United States. So, you know, what would be your reaction to that? You know, what are the kind of resources does Cambodian government have to handle this sort of a situation? Because what we are looking at is actually very big money. And as one American president once said, always follow the money. So, you know, who owns these scamming places? Where is the money coming from? And where is the money to combat that?
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'll answer both questions. So the first one around what does effective pressure look like? It's a good question, and I think it's a particularly hot question right now given the current crisis. I think we can call it a crisis between Thailand, diplomatic crisis between Thailand and Cambodia. But putting that one aside, effective pressure looks like identifying countries that can exercise leverage that will depend. It could either be through trade, bilateral relations, diplomatic, others, exercising leverage vis-a-vis Cambodia. I think the point of this report is we wanted to put the information out so that governments whose nationals are victims and or whose nationals have been scammed, we're talking a huge amount of victims, 2 types of victims, understand that Cambodia is the target here. Cambodian government needs to do more. ASEAN is a space where a lot of impacted countries come together, but there is also the policy of non-interference and not pointing fingers. So ASEAN, although of course we would encourage ASEAN member states, and including Malaysia as the chair, to bring this up in the next ASEAN summit, it is very unlikely that it will be done in a way that will identify Cambodia as the main, in this specific context of Cambodia, of course, the main culprit. But that is the hope. And with respect to sanctions, Amnesty International doesn't have a policy in terms of recommending sanctions, but it is a tool that many governments have used, including UK, Australia, the US. Whether or not they continue to do that would be obviously up to the states. But what we would say is whatever action taken, including by the Thai government, and they are taking actions already, it needs to consider unintended consequences, whether that's turning off water, internet, that's on the border, or sanctions to individuals or not, just to consider the unintended consequences. Thank you. And to the second question, who owns the scamming compounds? So that wasn't the focus of the report, but I can say from our evidence, every individual that we spoke to talked about broadly Chinese as being present, a Chinese boss, a Chinese manager as being present in all of the scamming compounds where these individuals were held. It wasn't only Chinese though. In some cases, they also talked about Thai individuals also being involved in the compound. We definitely have evidence of Thai recruiters, Thai nationals. It's unclear if the recruiters are in Thailand from our evidence or in Cambodia, but Chinese are not the only ones, but no doubt Chinese organized crime have huge interest here. The other question around, are there Cambodian interests? Of course, many in this room have already reported that in some instances there are links to high-level Cambodian officials. That is not part of the report or the scope of our report, but that is what many of you in this room have reported. And with respect to the US, well, you didn't say USAID cuts, you just said cuts. But the USAID cuts have had a direct impact, I can say, on anti-trafficking organizations who are key to the work. Like Mr. Jaruwat, I don't know if you're funded by USAID, but I'm just saying organizations like Mr. Jaruwat's. And obviously it's not only USAID, there are other governments who are pulling back from aid, and that will have an enormous, tremendous negative impact. We cannot stress enough how important, until states like Cambodia, including Thailand, take the right steps in this context, organizations like Mr. Jaruwat's are the only hope for many of these individuals. Thanks.
Any more questions?
Hi there, it's Philip Wen from the Straits Times. I was just wondering whether the crackdown, or limited crackdown back in February between the Thai and Myanmar border has any discernible effect on Cambodia and what's happening in Cambodia, in terms of whether there's any nexus at all between the flow of human trafficking and the networks that operate in those different countries. So, you know, to the extent that maybe that human trafficking may be seen as more difficult in one area, that has led to an increase in Cambodia?
You said February 2025?
Yes.
Shall I answer the question? Okay. Or
yeah,
wait,
sure.
yes.
Let's
Sorry.
yeah, no worries.
I'll answer that question. But I'll answer, and I don't have a great answer in that we haven't identified a discernible effect. We did research, as documented in this report, does span the period up to just a few weeks ago, actually. So we are able to confirm that a few compounds are alive as far as just a month ago. In that sense, we have continued to monitor and will continue to monitor the situation. What we have seen, though, with any quote-unquote crackdowns, is that they don't have a long-term effect. As we said, out of 53 scamming compounds, 2 appeared to be shut down, and many of them had raids. Of course, most of the state intervention were rescues, which are extremely limited in scope, but several of them did have raids, and we have instances where hundreds of people left a scamming compound and police intervened, and yet the compound, you know, a few weeks later, months later, continues to operate apparently as before. So we're not yet seeing that any of the crackdowns, raids, or actions that the Cambodian government keeps advertising are actually having a long-term impact or significant impact in the scamming industry and the human rights crisis. Thanks.
Okay, actually we have a question from Zoom. So let me read it out. Cesare Potko asked, in September 2022, the Cambodian authorities went into many compounds in Sihanoukville to do inspections and raids. How soon after this did you see scamming activity pick up at the compounds in Sihanoukville, like Kaibo and Jinshui, that were supposedly emptied out at the time? How long was it until they returned to business as usual? And what was the impact of these raids, if any? And I see maybe there's a question in the room as well, so maybe I'll take a couple.
Exactly. Phil Robertson with the Asia Human Rights and Labor Advocates. Actually, it's a similar question to the one that you've asked or got online. The Cambodian government has continued to use these sort of rescues where a couple people are taken out of the compound to say that they're doing something. And it would be helpful to know a little bit more about how those complaints are getting to the Cambodian authorities. Which ones do they act on? Is this coming from diplomatic missions, like, you know, various different embassies saying we have 10 of our people there, or 20 of our people there? If you could provide a little bit more about what is making the Cambodians act to rescue some people while ignoring the larger problem.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do you want to take that?
Yeah, I'll take both, but I think it would be really good to hear from Mr. Jaruwat on the second question. Do you want to start? Yes, go ahead.
โอเค thank you ก็คือปัญหาที่รัฐบาลเขาเรียกว่าตำรวจกัมพูชานะครับเข้าไป take action ให้เนี่ยจริงๆเขา take action ในส่วนของเราร้องขอว่าเขาถูกขังนะครับแต่เขาก็ไม่เคยยอมรับนะครับว่านี่เป็นการค้ามนุษย์แต่เขาจะมองเป็นเรื่องของการช่อโกงนะครับการพนันออนไลน์นะครับแล้วก็เขาจะโทษคนไทยเองด้วยว่าคนไทยเนี่ยลักลอบเข้าเมืองเพราะว่าส่วนใหญ่คนที่ตกอยู่ในกระบวนการค้ามนุษย์เนี่ยเขาผ่านทางช่องทางธรรมชาติเพราะมีคนพาข้ามนะครับเขาจะถูกดำเนินคดีก่อนกลับบ้านส่วนใหญ่เขาอยู่2แล้วแต่เดือน2 เดือน 3 เดือนส่วนใหญ่ผู้เสียหายที่เราขอทางการกัมพูชาช่วยกลับมาเนี่ยต้องติดคุกก่อนติดคุกตม.รอการในประเทศนะครับเขาไม่เคยยอมรับเลยว่านี่เป็นเหยื่อจากการค้ามนุษย์ครับ
Great. So to the online question and to Phil's question, which as Phil said are quite similar, a couple of things. One is, and I didn't mention this, but you will see this when you go to the annex. The annex has a summary table at the beginning, and we have codes for each scamming compound. We don't use names. Many of these compounds are known by a name of X. Well, there are different reasons why they're called different names, but we don't have that. So you won't find those. and in particular, the question asked online refers to 2 sites that are here, but we don't refer to them as that. We refer to them by codes. So if you know the location, that's how you'll be able to find which code matches what. There are reasons for that, obviously. We do know the names, but for a number of reasons, we didn't include the names. So in any case, specifically to the question online, those 2 sites are here. And if you are having trouble finding the code, we can provide it bilaterally, separately. But for those 2, you will see exactly the impact that we have documented with respect to what happened after the raids that were reported. So that's that. But more generally, and to Phil's question, to add to Mr. Jaruwat, what we documented based on the survivors that we spoke to was that there are different ways by which people filed complaints and ultimately police officers came. But it was not, there isn't a clear answer in that. Sometimes they did use the hotlines that NCCT very much likes to advertise, and they do in the response that we received from them. But the majority of cases were not like that. The majority of cases took time for them to get someone to rescue them, quote unquote. So it could be contacting their embassy staff. A lot of embassy staff do take action, but also contacting friends who maybe were there, contacting family. We have a lot of cases where family members in their country of origin are contacted, then the family says, what do we do? And then they try to contact organizations like Mr. Jaruwat or others. So there's a number of ways. But what the NCCT says isn't happening, i.e. they have a hotline, actually, and a Facebook post website where you can complain. Obviously, a lot of these people don't even have access to Facebook, so it's a bit ridiculous. But anyway, and that mechanism that has been offered, so to speak, isn't working. So we do recommend that the Cambodian state have a different, more proactive way to identify individuals who are in these locations. And in fact, one thing to say, the NCCT noted this in 2022 when they responded to the UN Special Rapporteur's letter, and they did this again with us. They have acknowledged openly that they do not proactively investigate. They reactively investigate, which means that if they receive a complaint somehow, they will, likely or not, but that's when they take action. They don't sit down to proactively think, oh, maybe this site is a problematic site, let's go there. That's what they said. This is from their own reporting and their letter to us.
Thank you very much. Is there any more question from the floor? Okay, I see there's none, so maybe we can wrap up. So before we end the event, I'd like to share that we're planning to have a solidarity action for survivors of scamming compounds. So we have prepared some signs for people to hold, but this, of course, is optional. If you are interested, after the event, after the panel is finished, please feel free to come forward. But if you don't feel comfortable joining our solidarity action, there's refreshment at the back, so please feel free to enjoy yourself and remain there. We're gonna take a picture here, so if you don't want to be in the picture, please don't feel like you have to be. Okay, well, thank you so much.
One thing, there are a
okay,
few other
yeah.
questions that are coming in through Zoom, but
okay.
given that given that the event is coming to an end, we will respond to any of the Zoom questions directly on Zoom.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, so thank you very much to the two panelists for today's very fruitful discussion. We hope that you have learned what you wanted to learn from today's discussion, and if you're interested in reading the full report, here's the QR code. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to approach our panelists at the end. Thank you very much again for coming, and hope you have a lovely day.